Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you all are doing well. We're going to be discussing the case of two horrifying serial killers that not only took pleasure in torturing their victims, but took pleasure in killing them as well. So today we're going to be talking about them and going over their cases. And before we jump in, if you are interested in true crime and you like this type of content, I put out about 2 videos every week, so don't forget to hit that subscription button down below. Robert Berdella was born January 31st, 1949, into a deeply religious household in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Robert suffered with high blood pressure and an abusive father at a young age, although he did well in school despite being disliked by teachers and other students. When he reached puberty, he discovered that he was gay, but he kept it a secret, mostly due to the fact that in the 50s and 60s, being part of the LGBTQ+ was frowned upon. When Robert entered college, he began to flourish in school and was placed in an independent study program. He also began to engage in acts of torture against animals and also began drug use. In a cooking course he took at the Kansas City Art Institute, he killed and tortured a duck and a chicken in the presence of his fellow classmates. He also gave a dog sedatives and tranquilizers. And as many of you I'm sure know, serial killers often will kill animals and torture animals long before they even kill a person. This is something that's often done at a very young age. I'm surprised that Robert didn't do it when he was very young. I'm not sure maybe if he didn't tell police that or tell investigators later on, but it appears as if he started it while he was in college, which I find a bit unusual, but he still practiced this before he moved on to killing people. Robert met his first victim, Jerry Howell, at his booth at Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. He rented a booth at this flea market and sold items he stole to make extra income. His booth was located right across from Paul Howell's booth, and he began a friendship with Paul's son, Jerry. Robert became good friends with the 18-year-old, and Jerry confided in Robert that he worked as a male prostitute on the side. Robert promised to drive Jerry to a dancing contest in a nearby town, and instead he drugged Jerry until he was unconscious in his car. He then injected his victim with a tranquilizer before tying him to his bed, and over the course of 28 hours, Robert drugged, tortured, and sexually assaulted Jerry over and over. And on July 5th, 1984, Robert found Jerry dead. He believed that Jerry either choked on his own vomit or the drugs as well as the gag he put in Jerry's mouth prevented him from breathing. He then drained all of Jerry's blood and dismembered his body. Less than a year later, on April 10th, 1985, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon asked if he could stay with Robert. The two had known each other previously, although Robert was considered an inconvenience because he was not sexually attractive to Robert Berdella. So Robert Berdella would later tell police that Robert Sheldon was not sexually attractive. He wasn't interested in him. He wasn't originally planning on Robert Sheldon to be his victim, but he became very angry with Robert one day because he came home and he saw him drinking, and he decided to take his rage out on Robert Sheldon. He began to hold his victim captive on April 12th, where he was held for 3 days. Robert endured severe torture, such as his eyes being swabbed with drain cleaner and his ears being filled with caulking to reduce his hearing. 3 days later, he was suffocated and his body was stored for later dismemberment due to the fact that Robert had workers coming to his home to repair his roof. In June, Robert invited his neighbor Mark Wallace into his home because there was a severe thunderstorm outside. Robert later stated that he noticed Mark seemed depressed, so he offered his chlorpromazine to help him relax. Robert then rendered him captive and again tortured him until his death on June 23rd. Robert continued to kill and torture 3 more men. One in particular that stuck out to me and even further proves the fact that serial killers are often overlooked by police is his victim, Larry Wayne Pearson. The two met in 1987, and while Robert was allowing Larry to live with him in exchange for some household chores being done, Larry was cleaning and doing things like that around the house, Robert began to hold him captive and would not allow him to leave the home. And this went on for about 6 weeks until Robert was assaulting Larry in a sexual manner, and Larry bit his member off, if you will, and this just further shows me that Robert went to the hospital after this. After he got rid of Larry's body, he stored it somewhere until he could dismember it later. But this shows me that even after going to the hospital and telling a nurse and a doctor, probably multiple nurses and doctors, what happened to him, and he had like severe bite wounds, that nobody looked into him. And to me, if I was working in the hospital, I would think that's very odd. Why would somebody have like a really intense bite mark down there and not do anything about it? Not even have the police just do like a quick, a couple drive-bys by his house to see what's going on. Maybe just look into this guy a little bit. So it just shows that serial killers continually just like go through the cracks, and we'll never really know how many there are or were, because they just were constantly let through the system in many different ways. This is just one example that serial killers were easily able to get off. And on March 29th, 1989, Robert lured 22-year-old Christopher Bryson, who was a male prostitute, to his home for his services. Robert knocked him unconscious and bound him to his bed. He was tortured for 3 days until Robert told him he could be trusted and allowed him to be bound to his bed upstairs. While Robert was away at work, Christopher found matches on a nearby nightstand and was able to burn through his restraint. He jumped out of the second-story window and broke his foot in the process. He screamed at a meter maid who was working across the street to call the police. When police arrived, they found Christopher only wearing a dog collar, and they got his story. He was then promptly taken to the hospital, and the Kansas City police drafted a search warrant that same day after Robert did not allow officers to enter his home earlier in the day. Investigators corroborated Christopher's story as they found his bedroom he was staying in that had the burnt restraints on the bed, and found Robert's other torture devices such as an electrical transformer and a metal tray containing syringes, as well as various drugs and chemicals laying around the house. Investigators also found a human skull inside of the closet on the second floor and a partially decomposed human head in his backyard. They also found several other human remains in his home, as well as his floors and walls were extensively blood-stained. Robert also kept a keepsake collection of his victims. He has 334 Polaroids and 34 snapshot prints of his victims, as well as written records of what he had done to them. He also saved newspaper clippings regarding a missing young man who was Jerry Howell, his first victim. Robert was arrested and refused to cooperate with investigators. He used his right to silence and refused to provide handwriting samples to compare with the notes found in his home. Robert was sentenced to 6 months in jail for contempt of court while the investigators worked on building a case against him. On July 22, 1988, Robert was indicted for the murder of Larry Pearson and was sentenced to imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He originally pleaded not guilty to the other 5 murders, but made a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty with the remaining charges. And on December 19, 1988, Robert was given 5 additional life sentences for the other murders. And Robert ended up dying a couple years later in prison due to heart complications. But I found this case just really horrifying and scary, and it was just wild, like when I was reading about this case. And of course there was like a lot I couldn't fit into it, just because this video will be crazy long. But Robert was absolutely terrifying, like a horrible, scary person. And these pictures are online, the photographs that he took of his victims, but I don't recommend looking them up. If you do some research about this case, a couple of them will just pop up in the feed, but I don't recommend like going like hardcore and looking at them and like finding them, because they are really scary and they're pretty gnarly. Like I said, a couple of them popped up as I was doing research and they were pretty rough, so I definitely don't recommend looking it up. Just reading about this stuff is horrifying enough. Our next killer is Donald Henry Gaskins. He was born in Florence County, South Carolina on March 13, 1933. Donald had a troubling childhood, and he was raised by a neglectful mother and was abused by male relatives. When he was 1 year old, he drank a bottle of kerosene, which caused him to have convulsions for the next 2 years. He had violent behavior at a young age and was convicted for hitting a woman on the head with an axe after she caught him breaking into her home. He earned the nickname Pee-wee because of his short stature, and he was harassed by many kids in his school and neighborhood. Donald served a 5-year sentence in a reform school before he got a job at a tobacco plantation until he was convicted of attacking a teenage girl. He was sentenced to 6 years of imprisonment at the South Carolina Penitentiary. While he was in prison, he earned the respect of his fellow inmates by killing Hazel Brazel, in which he claimed self-defense. He also gained 3 more years in his sentence because of this murder. Donald escaped prison in 1955 by hiding in the back of a garbage truck and fled to Florida. He began working for a traveling circus, but again was imprisoned until 1961 after he was caught. Donald claimed his first victim was in September of 1969, and he claimed he killed a blonde female hitchhiker who he left her body in a swamp after he murdered her. He claimed that he killed between 80 and 90 people during this time, and that he called them his coastal kills. And he just claimed that he killed hitchhikers and pretty much random people, all in a similar manner, mostly choking and leaving their body somewhere in nature where they most likely wouldn't be found. But none of these have ever been proven, and he wasn't able to give locations of any of the bodies, so it is widely believed that he didn't do many of these murders, but I do believe that there was a really large chunk of time where we really don't know what he was doing between like 61 and 69. So it is believed that he, was probably killing people and doing things that he shouldn't have been doing, because he does have a very extensive criminal activity as well besides actually murdering people. But we weren't able to ever really find out exactly how many people he killed because, again, he couldn't give a lot of details about these. He mostly seemed as if he was making a lot of these murders up. However, in November of 1970, he began a confirmed killing spree that started off with his niece, Janice Kirby, who was 15 years old, and her friend Patricia Ann Alsbrook, who was 17. He beat both girls to death when he was in a drug-induced rage. In March of 1971, he poisoned Martha Ann Dix because she either claimed Donald was the father of her child or because she was a drug dealer. Again, many of Donald's claims were all over the place, and he was not able to tell the investigators why exactly he killed some of his victims. And in June of 1973, Donald killed Doreen Hope Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter Robin after he learned that Doreen had become pregnant by an African-American man. Donald had known Doreen for a few years before he killed her, and he was enraged by the fact that she was having another biracial child, and this made him so angry as he was a very intense racist. He very much disliked anybody who wasn't white, and so when he found out, he lured Doreen to his home, and he ended up drowning Doreen and Robin in a small creek or lake in his backyard. And so I found that really sad and just really unnecessary. Really all of the murders of course are unnecessary, but anybody who seemed to cross him in any way whatsoever, he just decided to get rid of. His murder spree continued until 1975, and he killed for a variety of different reasons, including a murder-for-hire scheme, crossing state lines with a minor, and his involvement with an auto theft ring. Most of his murders involved killing people who witnessed his crimes, and he did not want them to go to the police. Donald was arrested on November 14, 1975, when a criminal associate named Walter Neely confessed to the police that Donald killed Dennis Bellamy and Johnny Knight. He led police to Donald's home, and they discovered 8 bodies of his victims. During his trial, Donald was tried on 1 charge of murder on May 24, 1976. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. While in prison, Donald committed another murder, and on September 2, 1982, he killed Rudolph Tyner, who was in prison for killing an elderly couple during a robbery at their business. Rudolph was on death row and in the process of appealing his own death penalty. The couple he murdered's son, named Tony Kaimo, hired Donald to kill Rudolph for $2,000 because the appeals process was taking too long. Donald somehow obtained plastic explosive with a blasting cap and a long wire and a radio speaker. He created a makeshift bomb and he put that into Rudolph's ear, which killed him. Donald was executed on September 6, 1991 by the electric chair. He attempted to kill himself hours before by slitting his wrists. So what do you all think about these cases? I found them very interesting and really sad. Of course, with Robert, you don't really hear about that like extreme torture really that often. We often hear about serial killers, and of course that's wrong and terrible in general, but really extreme forms of tortures that Robert was doing, you really don't hear about that super often, and it's just scary. Like, that's just really horrifying to read about. And of course Pee-wee was awful as well, and he just seemed like somebody who was really unhinged and was willing to kill anybody who got in his way because he wanted to just continue on with this criminal activity and do whatever he wanted. And I'm wondering if him drinking like the kerosene when he was really young had like a great effect on his mind. I would imagine that would, because any sort of like chemical or gas or something like that you would consume is going to change you. So I'm wondering if that had like a bad effect on his brain and that caused him to be so crazy. But yeah, otherwise I found these really interesting. I would like to do in-depth videos on both, so let me know if that's something you guys will be interested in, because there was so much information online about both of these cases. I do feel like they both definitely deserve an in-depth video, but I just couldn't put it all in this video because they would be like extremely long. So let me know if that's something you guys are interested in, and otherwise I hope you guys stay safe out there and have a great day. Bye bye.